Hello everybody and welcome to the Quilters Apothecary. It is time for a flash toot, and for this particular flash toot we are going to talk a little bit about something that is not fun. In fact, it actually stinks, and that is seam ripper. When you are doing your surface quilting and something happens that you are unaware of, God forbid, and it happens to all of us. You know, I always say probably in my 20-something years of quilting, and probably, like I said, way over 9,000 quilts, I actually have taken out a total of probably 7 king-size quilts worth of quilting. I mean, it just happens. Now, most of that happens pretty early on. So if you're new, it's kind of part of the tuition. Very rarely now do I ever have to rip anything out. You get to a point where that's just not something you need to do. You get real good with tension, so you know how to set your tension properly. You also get real good with checking everything on a regular basis so that you don't make those types of mistakes. I know for me personally, when I'm working in a row, I go ahead, I'll quilt a little bit when I first start a brand new quilt, and then very simply, I go under the quilt and I check out how things are looking underneath, and I make sure that everything is set perfect. So I usually quilt, like I said, about a foot or two, and then I check it, and if everything's good, everything's good. The other thing that I will say is I always tell people, you know, the little magic, let's pull our thread through if we need to change a spool of thread. I always remind everybody, especially for those with the disc tensioners rather than the other tensioner, the rotary tensioner, that you really do need to make sure that every time you pull thread through, you have got to re-scissor it right into the disc tensioner. Because a lot of times I find on my disc tensioner machines, every single time I do a thread pull through after tying thread on, it always comes out from between that disc tensioner, and I'm just used to automatically scissoring that right back into the disc tensioner. Now with the rotary tensioners, you don't have to worry about that so much because it already winds through, but I definitely check my thread path and I do a good pull to make sure that everything's okay as far as tension is concerned. The other thing that I will say that has helped me immensely is that I'm pretty brand specific and loyal when it comes to my thread. So definitely I suggest find threads that you like. For me, I have 2 threads that I use pretty regularly. They are, of course, the Isocord and the Glide. Both are 40 weight polys. Do I use other things? Absolutely I do. I don't use anything else in my bobbin most of the time. Once in a blue moon, I'll use a 60 weight in my bobbin if I'm going to be doing microfill, but most of the time I'm going to be using my Isocord or my Glide in my bobbin, and they both run exactly the same tension on all of my machines. My Handy Quilters, my Innovas, and any of the other brand of machines that I have, everything runs the same. So once I set my thread tension in my bobbin, I'm pretty good to go. So tension is not really a big issue for me. And I've been doing enough quilts that I don't make bad thread color choices. I've learned that dark threads go best on dark fabric. You know, usually, like a lot of new people will do an edge to edge, and just because there's a little bit of dark purple thread, I'm using that as an example, dark purple fabric, excuse me, in the quilt, and they tend to like purple, they'll grab a dark purple thread to do an edge to edge on that quilt with, and what they find is that dark purple can look really gaudy on some of the light areas. And so I always say when you're doing an edge to edge on a quilt, aim towards the medium to medium light type of threads, and that's going to be your friend. You don't want to go too dark with your threads. But again, the time to notice that is your first quarter of a row. And I know it's frustrating for you. You just start quilting a quilt and you are doing an edge to edge or even a pantograph, and you get about a quarter of the row in. For my new people, stop and look. And look at it and evaluate it, because it's so much easier to take out a quarter of a row than it is to take out 4 rows when you finally realize, you know, I'm lying to myself. And we do that. New quilters do it especially, and I think every quilter has done this before, where it's like, oh, I think it'll be okay. Just wait till the quilt's done and it'll look fine. And then the quilt's done and you're looking at that thread choice and it's too dark and it's gaudy and you're like, what was I thinking? So again, those are just some ways to keep you from having to use this, or my preference is my 18 millimeter rotary cutter, and we're going to talk about that. This is all about skinning a quilt, skinning a whole quilt if you have to. And my best friend Patrick, I had to help him skin 3 whole quilts at one time just because something else happened, and that was the bobbin case was dropped. And what he did not notice was that the check spring came out of the bobbin case. And everything ran sort of okay. The tension looked okayish at first glance. And he did 3 quilts in a row. And I'll tell you, it looked good. Took the quilts off the machine, reloaded a new one. He was on a marathon quilting thing. We were away, and then when I got back, we looked at it together, and it's like, ooh, you know, that tension, we got some pokies and we've got some loose stitching going on here. We don't want to put that out. And so we skinned 3 quilts. If I would have used the seam ripper, the traditional seam ripper, that would have taken us probably a month and a half. But because we worked together, and we used the rotary cutter and we did the skinning method, we actually skinned all 3 of those quilts in about a day and a half. I think maybe a bottle of wine and definitely some pizza and some good movies. But we sat together and we got those 3 quilts done in a day and a half, and that would have taken us a lot of time. So let me take a second and let's talk a little bit about that. So when that happened, the first thing that I did when I saw that we needed to take that out, instead of saying, oh my gosh, this is going to take a month and a half and what are we going to do? I know enough now where if it's a whole quilt that I have to take out, I immediately, these were client quilts, I immediately called the clients, and what I said was, we had a tension issue we didn't realize we had. I am going to replace the backs, and on one of the quilts, it was a backing fabric that could not be found again, and so I did get her permission. I did tell her that we would give her the quilting for free on that because we couldn't replace the backing with the same fabric, and it was very special to her, sadly. So I think I gave her another free edge to edge along with that. You know, it's just that's the price you pay when something like that happens. But the other 2 I didn't have to worry about. They were just happy that we were going to fix the semi-mistake. Now, I will say this. You know, I asked, I kind of made him work with me to take those out. A lot of people would have said that tension's close enough to good, and I think we've all done that too when we're new. It's like you're looking at the tension and it's not quite perfect. It's not eyelashing, but the tension's not quite right. And you're saying, I don't think the client's going to notice that. You know, and I always say that is the one thing you fix immediately is bad tension. You never want bad tension because even if they didn't notice, there's going to be 20 people at your guild group when they show that quilt during show and tell that they're going to look at that tension and they're going to realize that tension is not dead on. And they know who the quilter is because they're usually mentioned during the show and tells. So this is something to keep in mind. So number 1, I usually say definitely the 18 millimeter seam ripper. There are 2 different ways. If I have to only take out like 1 row of quilting at the beginning, that's different. I can, and I don't have anybody to call at that point. I can go ahead and I can do it while it's loaded on the machine. I'm going to show you how I do that. But if it's a whole quilt that I have to take out, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to take that quilt right off the frame. I'm just going to call it a loss. Remember, this is not something you're going to do often, God willing. This is going to just be a once in a while thing. I'm going to take it off. I'm going to call a friend of mine. I'm going to say, hey, will you please come and sit with me for a half a day? I'll give you whatever you want. Just come and sit with me for half a day and help me take this out. And I'll show you why I use an extra person. That just makes it go so much faster and it makes that job go quick. So again, I am going to pay 30 or 40 or 50 bucks if it's a client quilt or whatever to replace that backing. I'd rather do that because $50, $60, even if it's a $70 backing, is definitely worth 3 weeks of picking out with a seam ripper and still towards the end of that accidentally nailing the backing and putting a little hole in it, and you can't use it anyways. So I just say call it a loss if you have to take out a whole quilt, replace the back, and just get over it, and make sure not to make those same mistakes again often. Okay, so let's head over. Let's see how I'm going to do this with somebody, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show you how I do it alone, and hopefully that will save you a lot of time and energy. Okay, so now I have my helper over here. Patrick, show your hands. All right, so now what I do is I have a helper who I have coerced into helping me rip out a quilt. And what we're going to do is, this is simply just a sample that we use for test driving the machines. Obviously, this is the top, we've got the batting, and then we've got the backing. So when we actually start to skin, we're actually going to go between the backing and the batting. We never go through, just like I'd said before, the quilt top and the batting, because if you nail this, you're in trouble. But again, typically what I'm going to do if I'm going to take out a whole quilt is I'm going to replace the back. That's going to save me days of ripping out. That is worth 40 or 50 bucks to replace a back rather than taking days and days and days of labor to do that. Okay, so now he's going to spread that apart. I'm going to use my 18mm rotary cutter, brand new blade, and I'm simply going to go in, and of course I'm going to be very careful of his fingers, and I'm just going to hit that while he's pulling that apart gently. And of course you always want to use a new blade. See, now that is actually taking out while he's pulling that. I simply touch it barely and I just skim it, and it's going to actually pull out a ton of stitches. Just barely touch it, barely touch it. And like I had said before, I set and took out 3 large quilts with Patrick a few years back, and it took probably about a day and a half to do 3 queen size, 2 queen and a king size quilt. Now we did replace the backing, and he wants to put a nice amount of pressure. Now let me show you this real quick. Let go. Thank you. Notice here the holes. Nothing's bad here. So once we get this taken out, we can actually hit this with just a little bit of either spray starch or something, and those holes are going to close right up. I have not nailed this yet. Again, and again, we're going to be careful. You start to get a rhythm. You make sure to be aware of the blade. You kind of get in the rhythm, pull back. I always make sure, Patrick and I are really used to doing this together. So I pull back, he stretches it apart. I pull back, he stretches it apart. Now that's the basting on the edge. So now, Patrick, if you want to go in here where we actually have some quilting, let's go right in there and work in that section. Again, I just touch it, touch it, touch it, touch it, touch it. And again, I'm not, in case I do nick that back, I am not, the quilt top is in no danger. Now we're going down into the feather work, and we're just going to continue right down into there. He's got to give it a little bit of tension down into there, and now we'll get around these edges right here just to give us a little bit more meat on that bone. Let's go here. This isn't a garlic day, so if you're going to be doing this with someone, you don't want to order pizza, like I said earlier. Cookies and snack, maybe a bottle of wine. Okay, and then again, we're just going to stretch, but we're not really torturing that fabric. Trying to keep my head out of that shot there. Again, we'll just keep moving through that. And again, you have to get in the rhythm with the person to lift before they move. And then lots of little micro quilting there. And even with that micro quilting, I can tell I still haven't nicked this practice backing that couldn't be fixed with just a little bit of spray starch. Close up those holes. And so that is exactly how you would work through this whole quilt. And by the time you're done, of course, what then you would do, let's take it to a wider shot right here on the table. And of course, we've taken out all of this. We took out a whole bunch of feather work here. And you see how fast that went in just a few minutes. So this whole section here, if this were actually quilting all over, like I said, you could do probably 2 quilts in a day. You know, it's definitely sit-down work. You definitely want to have a partner with you. And then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you over to one of the machines, and I'm going to show you exactly how I would do it if I were by myself and I were taking out a whole quilt by myself. Okay, so now what we're going to do is let's take a second and talk about, let's say you've loaded a quilt, you've done your first row, and oops, bad tension. And obviously you don't want to actually unload the quilt and then take out everything with the quilt off and then have to reload it. So if it's like my first row and I don't catch something, and it's been a long time since I've done that, but it's not impossible. And I know a lot of new quilters, well, and even some of us seasoned quilters have a moment sometimes. And so what I would do instead of unloading it is I'm going to bring you down here with the camera to this roller. Obviously, this is how our quilt is loaded normally. We're going to go just a little bit lower so they get a good shot. Perfect. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off my side clamp and I'm going to unroll this. Unroll, 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 unroll. Doesn't matter what brand of machine you have, all the rollers are pretty much the same. And then re-roll. Just keep rolling, but roll it back up the opposite way, because then what's going to happen is that's going to bring the quilt top up and towards you. Hold that thought. Let me slide down here to even that roller. You don't need to see that. I'll come back. Okay, and then I'm just going to keep rolling, and you can see now what's going to happen. So now I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to roll this up, and Mr. Patrick, could you do me a favor, and would you unsnap the rollers there? And thank you, and the other one there. Okay, and just hold that for just a second for me. And I'm going to roll this up, and what'll happen is now this, I have access to this. And now, just like when Patrick was holding the quilt for me, now I actually have access to this. So he's going to go ahead, he's going to retighten those clamps. And he's going to tighten his bars. And what that's going to do is that's going to add tautness to the quilt, nice and tight. Excellent. And then a little bit more. Good. Okay, that's it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and we're going to bring you over here, and I'm going to show you how easy that's going to be now to lower my batting, and now I have access to between the backing and this with a bit of tautness on it. Now I can grab my rotary cutter, and now I can go ahead and stretch the top out and actually go ahead and repeat that same process without having somebody hold it. Is it as convenient as having a friend hold it for you? No, it's not. But that being said, it does work if you're in a jam and you can't find a friend to help hold it. So there we go. So that's another part of how to skin a quilt if you don't have a friend to help you.